So, Heng-Wen, what is Taiwan's strategy for semiconductors from an economic security perspective?
If a war breaks out between the Taiwan Strait, the impact on the whole world will be unimaginable. So not only will digital products be unable to be shipped, but the entire world will also stop functioning. Therefore, the whole world should work together to avoid the disaster happen. However, many media have said that Taiwan is currently the most dangerous place in the world. Actually, Taiwanese people have never wanted to provoke any cross-strait conflict. They want to choose their own way of life, including freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. This is a system recognized by most countries, but China is not willing to let the Taiwanese people make such a choice.
So is TSMC a deterrent for Taiwan? I mean, motivation for the United States, Japan to protect Taiwan?
Yeah, TSMC is, I think it is a very good, stable power in the whole world. Yeah, because especially for Taiwan. Yeah, because right now we always say silicon shield for Taiwan. Right now, TSMC also invests in United States, Japan, and Germany in the future. Therefore, as long as the United States, Japan, and Taiwan cooperate well, there should be enough deterrent force to prevent military actions from happening.
Rana, from the United States' point of view, is the TSMC's expansion overseas, does it reduce the effectiveness of the silicon shield for Taiwan?
You know, honestly, I'm not sure how effective the silicon shield would be long-term anyway. I think Taiwan's future, as the gentleman just said, is largely dependent on how China decides to approach Taiwan. But I think the idea of expanding and creating more manufacturing nodes, creating more economic diversity, rather than focusing on concentration of particular products in particular geopolitical places, is the best strategy, not just for Taiwan, but for the world. I mean, one of the big picture background issues here, which goes way beyond semiconductors, is that the global trading system over the last 20 years has essentially created a lot of concentration. There's been a sort of a cheap capital for cheap labor bargain between the US and Asia. Companies basically try and silo their supply chains, do things as cheaply as possible. And that's part of this neoliberal philosophy that as long as share prices are going up and consumer prices are going down, doesn't matter what else happens.
Mm-hmm. And Akira, what is your view on this?
Global supply chain is the best. However, the current situation is going to the different direction already. So Japan need to protect our technology or improve the technology more. Otherwise, our country also facing the problem. The currently equipment company, materials company, only key engineer go to US or Europe, IMEC, and Samsung TSMC to develop the new machine and the new materials. It means the local Japanese engineer cannot get the experience to develop the leading edge technology.
What is the best strategy for Japan going forward in this changing semiconductor industry for Japan?
Only semiconductor technology is not the key. But passive components and motor and PCB and connector, battery, many other devices. Fortunately, Japan, we have a very good passive component company like Murata, TDK, and good motor company, Nidec, and other many companies. So we need to think about the module, to make the module, to combine those small devices to make more high performance modules to compete with the other country.
Victor, what do you think of Akira's strategy for Japan and Japan Inc.?
I listened very carefully to the remarks by the distinguished panelists from Japan and from Taiwan. I think I actually agree with many of the points they made. I think the decisions made by many of the semiconductor companies in Japan, in Taiwan, in Netherlands, elsewhere, etc., these were not business decisions. These were political decisions being forced upon these companies by another country. Now, this country happens not to be China for very obvious reasons. I think it will be very messy, but one thing is certain in this great scene of chaos. That is, China rises up and China picks up all the pieces and China will push forward for complete independence in semiconductor industry.
Okay. Rana, do you have anything to say to that? And I also want to ask about Japan's strategy of semiconductors mentioned by Akira.
Yeah, no, I was actually interested to come in on the point about Japan because Akira, I think, was starting to move towards a topic that we haven't mentioned yet, which is friendshoring. And the idea, this is a word that Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, came up with actually in a conversation I had with her a couple of years ago at the Atlantic Council. And the idea is that countries with shared values and synergistic needs should actually work together to create new and more resilient supply chains. And I see a tremendous amount of possibility for the U.S. and Japan to work together in that arena, and not just in chips.
And Huan Wen, do you have any opinion about Japan's strategy? And I also want to ask you about Taiwan's strategy.
Yeah, because right now, semiconductor is a very very burning money industry. You should invest a lot of money in the very advanced technology and also very high capex. Yeah, you have to invest. Right now, a plant is about more than 10 billion US dollars. So that's a huge money. So I don't think every country can subsidize forever. Yeah, you can subsidize 1 year, 2 years, but you cannot subsidize for 10 years. So we need globalization.
Akira?
I have a little different opinion.
Okay.
As I mentioned before, Lapita's key mission is educate the Japanese engineer and support semiconductor equipment company and materials companies engineer to develop the future technology. That is the key mission, I think.
So engineers.
Engineer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Rana, you mentioned friendshoring. So does the United States want to have two supply chains for semiconductors, one centered on the U.S. and other led by China?
The U.S. is definitely interested in developing supply chains that are robust and resilient with partners that share its values, democratic values, liberal values. It's interesting because Catherine Tai, who's the U.S. TR, has spoken of a post-colonial trade paradigm. And I really quite like that phrase because, again, if you think about how trade has worked for so many decades and indeed many hundreds of years, it's often been controlled by a handful of powerful forces, be it countries or companies. And so the idea now, not just thinking about the U.S. or China, but thinking about the global North and the global South, how can we make sure that all countries have an equal stake and equal share in the system? How can we make sure that things are not extractive? So I think the flaw, I'll be honest, the flaw in the first Trump administration was that they simply used tariffs as the sole tool in the arsenal. And tariffs are not that. You know, you have to have a competitive strategy at home if you want to succeed, right? I mean, every country knows that. I think the Biden administration has said, look, we are going to use tariffs where appropriate when we feel that they're non-WTO compliant, non-fundamentally fair market practices in play, and that's okay. But we also have this incredibly elaborate industrial strategy that we're developing in the U.S., which is creating certain manufacturing hubs, often in areas that have been less economically advantaged. So it's about balancing wealth and dealing with inequality as well. It's about working into issues like 21st century labor training. It's about, as we just discussed, trying to find new ways to interact with partners abroad. So there's a lot of difference, I think, between the two approaches that Biden and Trump have taken.
So, Akira, how do you see the semiconductor industry changing from your point of view?
Semiconductor market last 30 years, 40 years was driven by the personal computer, smartphone, and flat TV, that type of the consumer goods. From now, every country already announced to succeed the GX, carbon neutral policy. That will be driven by the government. New market will start from now. Semiconductor industry growth rate will be increased. Of course, the supply and demand balance is important. Every country's support subsidy to develop the semiconductor industry now, that is maybe over investment and oversupply.
Right. So you're saying that in the future, semiconductor industry will not be, motivated by consumption, but more of government policy. Right. So Huang Wen, what do you say to that?
My opinion is that global industry supply chain will change a lot in the future. Now, because of the U.S. and the China chip war, some, I have to say, many foreign investments have withdrawn from China, including many Taiwanese design and packaging manufacturers. China has to independently develop various advanced processes and technologies. I think all countries will face challenge, but in China, the challenges are even greater. Every country do what they do best. Yeah, but right now, China has to do all the things. That will be very difficult and challenging. Yeah.
So, Victor, what do you say to that?
The panelists just now said the U.S.-China semiconductor war. No, it's U.S. war of semiconductors against China. It's one directional. It's not bi-way or two-directional. And allow me to add a very quick point. I listened very carefully to what the distinguished panelist from the United States said, and with due respect to her, allow me to make one point. If she is really serious about values, etc., she should go to the White House and try her best to convince President Biden to approve Nippon Steel's acquisition of U.S. Steel. No one says that Japan and the United States do not have a lot of values very similar, if not identical to each other. So why should the United States deny Nippon Steel's bid to buy U.S. Steel, which is on sale? And I truly believe no one in Japan would ever forget that it was the United States which plunged the Japanese semiconductor industry from the pinnacle of the industry to the low end and never recovered from the highs in the 1980s. I think every country needs to do what is best for itself, considering its own independence and using its own brain power to make the decision, rather than being dictated by any other country in the world. And globalization is still the best path going forward. All of us need international cooperation. No one should indulge in the fantasy that by dictates it can change the supply chain in the world, which has been built up for decades.
Rana, you had something to say?
Yeah, I just want to respond to the gentleman from China's point about Nippon Steel, which I actually think is a good point.
Yeah.
And in fact, I wrote a column arguing that that the U.S. and the Biden administration should have let that deal go through. Now, let me explain, though, why it didn't happen. That deal didn't go through only because this is an election year. And it's a huge election year, an election that matters enormously, not just for the U.S., but for the world. The Biden administration needs steelworkers, and he needs Pennsylvania. It's a swing state. Why does he need labor right now? Why does he need those swing states in the hollowed out Rust Belt? Because of the bad decisions that the U.S. made to let the entire industrial commons go overseas, and largely in big chunks of it to China. That was not a good decision for national interests. Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor in the U.S., gave a speech last April, and he said, look, we've reached a turning point. It's very clear that the world is not, and China in particular, is not going to come seamlessly into the Washington Consensus and into the Bretton Woods system. Perhaps that's appropriate. You know, these institutions were largely developed by Western powers in the post-World War II period. We need growth now that's not just growth at all costs, not always cheaper is better, not always thinking about cheap clothing made with slave labor, or, you know, environmental standards that don't take into account the fact that coal-produced electricity has a carbon cost for the world. We need growth that is sustainable, meaning we probably need to put some kind of a price on carbon at some stage, or come up with a mechanism for dealing with carbon, and is equitable, meaning you're putting a floor under labor standards. You simply can't compete in markets where you have subsidized labor, substandard labor, and environmental standards that don't take into account the entire cost of a product. And that's the direction we're going, and it's a good direction.
So, Victor, what do you say to that? So the U.S. does not want to repeat what it experienced with the steel industry against China.
I was full attention listening to the distinguished panelist from the United States. Allow me to raise one objection. She said substandard labor in China. The Chinese labor is up to any standard in the world. The Chinese workers work really very hard, and they make huge sacrifices.
They're underpaid, and they're not treated well.
Standard. They are treated well. And you can come over to visit us, and I hope I will help you to escort you on many of these visits. Using your own eyes will help you.
I hope you'll
gain
take me to
better understanding of the
Xinjiang.
reality.
I hear it's pretty difficult for journalists to get in there, though.
Xinjiang borders with Afghanistan and has suffered 20 years of the spillover of radicalization from Afghanistan in a war of 20 years led by the United States against Afghanistan. The repercussion is still there. We hope it will recover.
It's about China exporting its own problematic negative externalities of its own model to the rest of the world, and it's unacceptable.
I hope you will do your real homework and visit Xinjiang before you make such representations.
Okay, let's get back to semiconductor industry for now, okay? So do you think there will be two separate supply chains for the semiconductor industry? Akira?
Yeah, I think so. That is the current situation, yes.
Hong-Wen?
Yeah, just Akita-san mentioned, because I cover LED display industry for many years. In China, government subsidized many companies to compete with other vendors in other countries. They have, China is a very big country, so they have a lot of resources and people. So if they focus on some industry, even United States or other companies cannot compete with them. China subsidized. China expend a lot of money in the industry. Yeah, so a lot of other Asian company cannot compete with them.
Victor, what do you say to that?
Well, when we talk about subsidies, look at how the United States government is subsidizing the semiconductor industry. Don't be fooled by what you want to believe. Look at what's happening just in front of our eyes. Subsidies for Boeing, subsidies for Airbus, subsidies for the agricultural products. When you talk about subsidy, open your eyes. There are many ways, many forms of subsidies by different countries, including by the biggest economy in the world.
Okay, so I think we should wrap up now. So in view of all the discussions we've had, what is your biggest concern about the semiconductor industry, and do you see any positive signs in the future? Victor.
I believe after the chips war is over, the world will still be one world, and globalization being pushed to 2.0 will continue. And the Cold War mentality eventually will not generate any benefit for any country. The world is big enough to accommodate both a very successful United States and a successful China. At the same time, China and the United States are not opposite against each other. And I believe China and the United States will eventually get along with each other and become two major engines for the growth of the world economy in the future.
Rana?
I think that one of the big challenges to reindustrialization and creating more resiliency and more nodes of production is that it takes time, right? Building a chips industry is a years-long, decades-long project, and there's a lot that can happen in the world between now and the next 10 or 20 years. And so we have to just stay focused on the future, stay focused on the big goal, keep our eyes on the prize. That can be difficult sometimes in the U.S. because we have a liberal democracy, and like it or not, elections are part of that.
And Hong-Wen?
Taiwan is a very small island, so we just do what we can do. We do a good job to manufacture for all the customers. I think that is a good strategy for Taiwan.
And Akira?
Yeah, the globalization is the most important for the worldwide. So I agree the political issue will not support the industry growth.
Thank you for your comments and your lively discussions. That wraps it up for this edition of Global Agenda. I'm Yuko Fukushima. Thanks for watching.